The heavy glass doors of Crestview Bank swung open as a man stepped inside, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor, and he took a moment to glance around. The bank was busy, customers waiting in line, employees moving behind the counters, and the faint hum of conversation filling the air. But it didn't take long for his presence to shift the energy in the room. A woman at the front desk, dressed in a crisp white blouse and a name tag that read Lisa, eyed him with suspicion. Her smile faded, replaced by a wary expression as she took in his dark skin, the neatly trimmed beard, and the confident way he carried himself. He didn't look lost. He didn't look like he needed help. But to Lisa, he looked like he didn't belong. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone tight, cautious. The man gave a polite nod. "I just need to speak to the branch manager." Lisa's lips pressed together. She glanced toward the back office, then back at him. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but we don't allow walk-ins for meetings. If you need assistance, you can wait in line." The man hesitated, studying her face. He knew this routine all too well. The skepticism, the assumption, the immediate judgment. But instead of pushing back, he simply nodded, stepping toward the waiting area. As he moved, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. The security guard near the entrance shifted slightly, standing a little straighter. A teller behind the counter whispered something to a colleague, both of them glancing in his direction. The feeling was unmistakable. He wasn't just another customer. He was being watched. Minutes passed. Customers who had arrived after him were greeted with warm smiles, directed to the right counters, helped without hesitation. But he remained ignored. Finally, he decided to approach one of the tellers, a young man named Greg. "Excuse me, Greg cut him off before he could finish. "Sir, you can't stand here. If you don't have business at the counter, you need to step aside." The man exhaled slowly. "I do have business here. I just need a moment of your time." Greg exchanged a quick look with Lisa, who shrugged. Then his tone sharpened. "If you're here for a loan or something, you should know we have specific requirements. It's best if you apply online." "I didn't say I was here for a loan," the man replied, his voice steady. "Well, then what do you need?" Greg's patience was thinning. Before the man could answer, another voice cut in, deep, firm. "Is there a problem here?" A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stepped forward. His name tag read Mr. Davis, branch manager. He looked at the man with the same guarded expression as the others, as if already convinced that his presence was a disruption. "No problem at all," the man replied, meeting Mr. Davis's gaze. "I was just hoping to speak with you." Mr. Davis crossed his arms. "About what?" A slow smile spread across the man's face. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black card, embossed with gold letters. He handed it to Mr. Davis, who took it hesitantly. As the manager read the name, the color drained from his face. The bank fell silent. The man standing before him wasn't just a customer. He wasn't a stranger. He was the owner. And he had seen everything. Mr. Davis's fingers tightened around the sleek black card. His eyes scanning the name again, as if reading it a second time would change the reality in front of him. The room, once filled with the murmur of conversations and the tapping of keyboards, had gone silent. Every employee within earshot had turned their attention to the scene unfolding before them. Even Lisa, who had been watching with mild disinterest, now stood frozen behind the desk. The man, the owner, waited patiently, his expression unreadable. He had seen this reaction before. It was always the same. The disbelief. The silent calculations. The attempt to justify their assumptions before realizing the truth. Mr. Davis cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he said, finally acknowledging the name on the card. I didn't expect you today." The man, Elijah Carter, tilted his head slightly. "I didn't schedule a visit. Thought I'd come by unannounced." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. Mr. Davis swallowed hard, his mind racing. Of course. We always appreciate your time. He let out a short, nervous laugh before glancing at the other employees. Why don't we step into my office? We can discuss. Elijah didn't move. We can talk right here. A flicker of discomfort passed over the manager's face. He had hoped to pull this conversation away from the staff, away from the watching eyes of customers who were beginning to sense something unusual was happening. But Elijah wasn't giving him that option. Greg, the teller who had dismissed him earlier, shifted uncomfortably behind the counter. Lisa, still gripping the edge of her desk, finally spoke, her voice weaker than before. Mr. Carter, if we had known. Elijah turned his gaze toward her, and she fell silent. It wasn't about knowing. It was about assuming. Mr. Davis forced another smile. I assure you, sir, our staff is trained to provide excellent customer service to everyone. He emphasized the last word, as if saying it could erase what had just happened. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Is that so? His eyes flickered toward the security guard, the tellers, Lisa, all the faces that had looked at him with suspicion the moment he walked in. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my team made some quick judgments before even asking my name. No one spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, thick with tension. Elijah finally stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. Tell me, Mr. Davis, how often do you turn away customers before they can even explain why they're here? The manager stammered. That's not what happened. Elijah remained silent, waiting. Greg, the young teller, spoke up, his voice hesitant. I just thought. I assumed you weren't a regular customer. And with how busy we are, He stopped himself, realizing how flimsy the excuse sounded. Elijah nodded slowly. You assumed. He let the words sink in before continuing. And Lisa, you were the first person I spoke to. What was your assumption? Lisa's face burned red. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Elijah exhaled, glancing around the bank. The customers who had been pretending not to listen were now openly staring. Some looked uncomfortable, while others watched with curiosity. Mr. Davis shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his polished shoes squeaking slightly against the marble floor. Mr. Carter, I assure you we take customer service very seriously. If there was any misunderstanding, I sincerely apologize. Elijah studied him for a moment, then glanced back at Greg and Lisa. A misunderstanding. He said it as if testing the word. Tell me, does this misunderstanding happen often? Silence. Elijah let his eyes wander around the space. His space. This bank wasn't just another branch in a faceless corporation. He had built it. He had invested in it. He had hired the very people who were now looking at him like a stranger. Finally, he took a step back, his voice quieter but no less firm. I didn't come here for special treatment. I came to see how my team treats every customer. And what I saw today. He let the words hang in the air. It's unacceptable. Mr. Davis's forehead glistened with sweat. We can do better. Elijah nodded once. You will do better. His tone was steady, leaving no room for argument. Lisa swallowed hard. Mr. Carter, we really didn't mean to. Elijah held up a hand, stopping her. You didn't mean to. I get it. He took a breath, his jaw tightening slightly before he exhaled. But intent doesn't erase impact. Greg looked down at his hands, fidgeting. Mr. Davis glanced around, searching for something, anything that could shift the moment back under his control. Elijah took another slow look around the bank, at the customers still waiting in line, at the employees now too nervous to meet his gaze. He had seen enough for today. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He slid his black card back into his pocket and straightened his suit. I'll be back, he said simply, before turning and walking toward the exit. As he pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the afternoon light, He could feel the weight of their stares behind him. The whispers had already started. The nervous glances. The realization that things were about to change. And for the first time that day, Elijah allowed himself a small smile. Let them talk. He was just getting started. The sun hung low in the sky as Elijah stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had expected some level of disappointment during his visit, but seeing it unfold firsthand, seeing the quiet prejudice laced in the way they dismissed him, left a weight in his chest. He walked toward his car, but before he could reach it, a voice called out behind him. "Mr. Carter, wait." Elijah turned to see Greg hurrying after him. His expression a mixture of regret and uncertainty. The young teller looked different now, less sure of himself. His confidence chipped away by the realization of what had just happened inside. Elijah didn't say anything, just waited. Greg shifted on his feet, glancing back toward the bank as if making sure no one else was watching. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't mean to treat you like that. He stopped, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I made some assumptions I shouldn't have." Elijah studied him for a moment before speaking. "And why do you think that is?" Greg hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe it's just how things are around here. People come in all the time asking for loans they don't qualify for, and we have to turn them away. I just thought," he trailed off, realizing how bad it sounded. "It wasn't personal." Elijah let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "It's always personal when you judge someone before you know them." Greg's face fell. "I get that now," he sighed. "I don't want to be that guy, Mr. Carter. The kind of person who treats people differently without even realizing it." Elijah nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Then don't be." Greg seemed to consider that, nodding slowly. "Are you really coming back?" "Oh, I'll be back," Elijah said without hesitation. "And next time, I'll be watching even closer." Greg swallowed hard but nodded again. "I understand." Elijah gave him one last look before heading to his car. As he pulled away from the parking lot, his mind raced with thoughts of what needed to happen next. Back inside the bank, the atmosphere had shifted. Employees whispered among themselves, sneaking glances toward Mr. Davis, who had retreated to his office with the door shut. Lisa sat stiffly at her desk, her fingers gripping the edge of her keyboard. She had replayed the moment over and over in her head, the look on Elijah's face when he revealed who he was. The shame that burned in her chest hadn't faded. Near the back of the bank, another employee, Karen, watched everything unfold with a tight frown. Unlike Greg or Lisa, she hadn't spoken to Elijah at all, but she had seen the way they treated him. She had felt the change in the room when he walked in. And now, watching her co-workers scramble to process what had happened, she wondered how many other customers had been treated the same way, without them even realizing it. That night, Elijah sat in his home office, the glow of his laptop screen casting soft shadows on the walls. His inbox was flooded with reports, financial statements, and updates from his various business ventures. But he barely glanced at them. His mind was still in that bank. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts before landing on the name he was looking for. With a tap, the call rang out. "Hey, Eli," a deep voice answered on the other end. "Marcus," Elijah greeted, leaning back in his chair. "I need a favor." Marcus chuckled. "You know I don't like the sound of that." Elijah smirked. "I need you to go to Crestview Bank tomorrow." There was a pause. "The one you own." "That's the one." Marcus was silent for a moment. "You're testing them, aren't you? Let's just say I want to see if today was a one-time thing. Or if there's a pattern." Marcus let out a low whistle. "You really think they're that bad?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "I know they are." Another pause. Then Marcus sighed. "All right. What do you want me to do?" Elijah glanced at the black card on his desk, the one he had handed to Mr. Davis earlier that day. "Just go in like any other customer. Some questions. See how they treat you. Marcus chuckled. You want me to act broke, don't you? Elijah didn't smile. I want you to act like yourself. There was a beat of silence before Marcus spoke again, more serious this time. All right, Eli. I'll go. The call ended, and Elijah leaned forward, tapping his fingers against the desk. If there was one thing he had learned in business, it was that people showed their true selves when they thought no one was watching. Tomorrow the test would begin. The next morning, the air inside Crestview Bank was thick with unspoken tension. Employees arrived on edge, their usual routine clouded by the weight of the previous day. Lisa kept her head down at her desk, typing mindlessly, but her thoughts kept circling back to Mr. Carter. Greg was quieter than usual, offering only half-hearted greetings to his co-workers. Mr. Davis, though trying to appear composed, had already checked the bank's entrance several times, as if expecting Elijah to walk in at any moment. At precisely 10:30 a.m., the doors swung open again. But it wasn't Elijah who entered. A tall man in a gray hoodie and dark jeans walked in. His steps slow and deliberate. His broad shoulders and confident posture made him stand out, but it was the way he scanned the room, watching, measuring, that gave the impression he wasn't just another customer. Marcus. He strolled toward the reception desk where Lisa sat. She glanced up, her professional smile faltering for just a second before she caught herself. Good morning, she said, folding her hands together. How can I help you? Marcus kept his expression neutral. I need some information about opening an account. Lisa nodded, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Of course. Do you have an appointment? Do I need one? Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. Lisa let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced. Not necessarily, but we usually recommend it. Marcus glanced at the near-empty waiting area. Doesn't look too busy. Lisa hesitated again before reaching for a brochure. Let me get you some details. She handed him the pamphlet, but her tone had already shifted. Polite but distant. Just like it had been with Elijah. Marcus nodded, flipping through the papers. And if I wanted to speak with someone in person? About loans, maybe. Lisa's polite smile wavered. Well, there are requirements, of course. Do you currently have an account with us? No, Marcus said simply. Lisa pressed her lips together before nodding. All right, I can see if one of our representatives is available. She picked up the phone and dialed an extension. As she spoke in hushed tones, Marcus leaned slightly against the counter, glancing around. Employees whispered to one another. Greg, behind the teller station, kept stealing glances his way. After a moment, Lisa hung up. Mr. Davis, our branch manager, is available to speak with you. Marcus smiled. Perfect. Lisa gestured toward the office door at the back of the bank, and Marcus made his way there. Inside, Mr. Davis stood behind his desk, his hands resting on the polished surface. Good morning, Mr. Davis greeted, his voice carefully measured. Please have a seat. Marcus sat down, his posture relaxed. Appreciate you making time for me. Mr. Davis forced a smile. Of course. What can I do for you? Marcus tilted his head slightly. Thinking about opening an account. Maybe looking into a loan. Mr. Davis nodded, but something in his expression shifted. Well, we do offer a variety of loan options, but they depend on a number of factors. Credit history, income verification, collateral. Have you had a chance to look at our requirements online? Marcus smirked. I figured I'd come in and talk to someone instead of clicking around a website. Mr. Davis chuckled stiffly. Understandable. I just want to be transparent with you. We have strict qualifications. Marcus held his gaze. Do you tell everyone that first, or just certain people? A flicker of discomfort crossed Mr. Davis's face, but he quickly covered it. I assure you, sir, we apply the same policies to all our customers. Marcus leaned forward slightly. You sure about that? Silence stretched between them. The air in the office felt heavy. Mr. Davis shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. Let me just take down some details, he said, reaching for a notepad. What's your current employment status? Marcus didn't blink. I own my own business. Mr. Davis hesitated before nodding. And your estimated annual income? Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Why don't we skip to the part where you tell me if I'd even qualify? Or did you already decide I wouldn't the second I walked in? Mr. Davis's fingers tightened around his pen. I assure you, sir, we don't make judgments like that. Marcus let out a small chuckle. That's funny. Because I walked in here just like Mr. Carter did yesterday. And I'm getting the same energy. Mr. Davis's breath hitched slightly, his expression faltering. He sat up straighter, as if trying to regain control of the conversation. Mr. Carter. Yeah, Marcus interrupted. That Mr. Carter. The one who owns this bank. The color drained from Mr. Davis's face. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. You know, you really should be more careful. 'Cause people like me, people like him, we see right through this. Outside the office, Lisa and Greg stood near the counter, their faces tense as they exchanged glances. They couldn't hear the words being spoken, but they could feel the shift in the air. After a long, painful silence, Marcus pushed his chair back and stood up. I think I've got all the information I need. Mr. Davis stood, his hands still gripping the desk. Mr. Carter sent you, didn't he? Marcus smirked. What do you think? Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. Every eye in the bank followed him as he crossed the lobby, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. As he reached the exit, he pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the sunlight. He pulled out his phone and dialed Elijah's number. It's exactly like you thought, Marcus said the moment Elijah picked up. Nothing's changed. Elijah's voice was quiet, controlled. Good. Marcus sighed. So what now? Elijah's grip on his phone tightened. His voice was calm, but beneath it was something sharper. Now, he said, we make sure they learn. That evening, as the city lights flickered against the darkening sky, Elijah sat in his office, staring at the phone in his hand. Marcus had confirmed what he already knew, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. This wasn't a one-time mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. A culture embedded so deeply into the way the bank operated that people like Mr. Davis didn't even hesitate before deciding who was worth their time. Elijah exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the desk. He had built his career on fixing broken systems, on seeing what others ignored and making sure change happened. But this was personal. He couldn't let it slide. Just as he was about to call his legal team, another name flashed across his screen. Karen. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He hadn't expected to hear from her. She was one of the few employees at the bank who hadn't spoken the day before, but he had noticed her watching, observing, and now here she was reaching out. He answered. Karen. A deep breath on the other end of the line. Then in a low voice she said, Mr. Carter, you need to see something. Elijah straightened in his chair. I'm listening. I probably shouldn't even be calling you, she admitted, her voice hesitant. But after what happened yesterday and then today with that other man, I can't stay quiet. Go on, Elijah urged. Karen hesitated for another second before continuing. I've worked at the bank for almost 5 years. I've seen the way Mr. Davis operates, the way he trains the staff to handle certain customers differently. He never says it outright, but we all know. And it's worse than just bad service. Elijah frowned. What do you mean? Karen lowered her voice even further. There have been applications, loans, mortgages, approved for some customers while others were denied for no good reason. Sometimes the paperwork goes missing when the applicant doesn't fit the profile they want. And Mr. Davis, he has a way of making sure those applications never make it past his desk. Elijah felt his pulse quicken. Are you saying he's deliberately discriminating? I'm saying he's been doing it for years, Karen confirmed. And he thinks no one notices. But I've been paying attention. And I have proof. Silence stretched between them. Elijah's mind raced. If what she was saying was true, this wasn't just about his own experience. It was bigger. How much proof? He asked finally. Karen inhaled sharply. Emails, internal memos, records that don't match up. I've kept copies. Elijah exhaled, his grip tightening around his phone. This wasn't just a bad manager with poor judgment. This was corruption. Karen, he said, his voice steady. I need you to send me everything you have. I will, she promised. But you should know something else. Mr. Davis, he knows something is up. After today he started making calls. I don't know who he's talking to, but he's scrambling. He's scared. That was interesting. Elijah leaned back in his chair, considering. If Davis was nervous, it meant he wasn't just some overconfident gatekeeper. He knew the consequences of being exposed. And now he was trying to cover his tracks. Elijah's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let him. Karen, he said, thank you for coming forward. You did the right thing. I just want to work somewhere that treats all customers fairly, she said. Not just the ones they think belong. You will, Elijah assured her. But first, we're going to make sure they learn their lesson. After hanging up, he sat still for a long moment, piecing everything together. This had started as a personal test, a way to see if the bank he owned truly upheld the values he built his empire on. But now it was more than that. This was about every customer who had been judged unfairly. Every person who had been turned away, not because they weren't qualified, but because someone like Mr. Davis had decided they didn't belong. And that was unacceptable. Elijah turned back to his laptop, his determination solidifying into a plan. It was time to expose the truth. But first, he had to let Mr. Davis keep digging his own grave. The next morning, the bank was buzzing with unease. Something was different. The staff moved cautiously, exchanging glances, sensing a shift in the air but unsure what was coming. Mr. Davis sat in his office, his fingers drumming anxiously against his desk. He had been making calls all night, trying to figure out what had changed, but no one had answers. He only knew one thing for certain: something was wrong. Then, at exactly 10 a.m., the doors swung open. Elijah Carter walked in. This time he wasn't alone. Behind him, a team of professionally dressed individuals followed, their expressions unreadable. Some carried briefcases, others held documents, but they all moved with purpose. Marcus was right beside Elijah, his face calm but his eyes sharp, scanning the room as they made their way toward the center of the lobby. Lisa nearly dropped the stack of forms in her hands. Greg stiffened at the teller counter. Karen, standing off to the side, took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was about to unfold. Mr. Davis's office door opened abruptly. He stepped out, his face pale but his expression forced into something resembling authority. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice strained but polite. "This is unexpected." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Is it?" Davis's eyes flickered to the group behind Elijah. He didn't know who they were, but he knew it couldn't be good. He forced a smile. "If you needed to discuss anything, you could have scheduled a private meeting." Elijah let out a short, humorless chuckle. "I think we're past that." The air in the bank had grown thick with tension. Customers in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something significant was happening. Employees tried to look busy, but their eyes kept darting toward the scene unfolding in front of them. Davis cleared his throat. "Look, Mr. Carter, if this is about yesterday, I can assure you." Elijah held up a hand, silencing him effortlessly. Then he turned slightly, gesturing toward one of the men behind him. The man, dressed in a dark suit, stepped forward and pulled out a folder. He opened it and began reading aloud. "After thorough internal review, we have gathered substantial evidence of unethical practices within this branch, including, but not limited to, discriminatory lending policies, deliberate mishandling of customer accounts, and the suppression of loan applications based on non-financial factors." A stunned silence filled the room. Lisa's face drained of color. Greg swallowed hard. Karen stared at the floor, gripping the edge of her desk. Davis took a step forward, his voice cracking slightly. "This is outrageous. Where are you getting this information?" Karen lifted her head. "From me." Davis turned sharply to face her, disbelief flashing across his features. "You?" She nodded, her voice steady despite the nervousness in her eyes. "I kept records. Emails, notes, everything. You thought no one was paying attention, but I was." Elijah crossed his arms. "And now I am." Davis opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, the suited man continued. "As of this morning, an official investigation has been launched into this branch's operations. Until its conclusion, all managerial authority is suspended." He closed the folder. "Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the bank. Employees exchanged panicked looks. Greg instinctively took a step away from Davis, as if distancing himself would erase his involvement. Davis was frozen, his face twisted with a mix of anger and desperation. "You can't just walk in here and—" "Oh, but I can," Elijah interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You see, Mr. Davis, you made a mistake. You assumed I was just another customer. Someone you could dismiss, ignore, or push out the door." He took a slow step closer. "You forgot that this is my bank." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Davis's mouth opened, but no words came out. Elijah let the silence stretch before turning to Marcus. "What do you think? Should we give him a second chance?" Marcus smirked. "I think he's had plenty of chances." Elijah nodded in agreement. Then, looking back at Davis, he said simply, "You're fired." The words hit like a thunderclap. Davis's face turned red. His hands clenched into fists, but he knew there was nothing he could do. He had lost. Security, who had been standing quietly near the entrance, stepped forward. Davis hesitated, then let out a sharp breath, his shoulders sagging as he turned and walked toward the door. As he passed Karen, he shot her a look filled with resentment, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, watching as he disappeared through the exit. For the first time in years, the bank felt different. Lighter. Elijah turned back to the remaining staff. "If any of you have been part of this, I suggest you reconsider your future here." His gaze swept over them, lingering on Greg, who quickly looked away. Then, softening his tone, he continued, "But if you've been waiting for a change, this is it." Karen straightened her shoulders, her expression filled with quiet determination. Lisa swallowed hard and nodded. Elijah exhaled, his work here almost done. But just as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. An unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Carter." Was. Then a deep voice spoke. "You think this ends here?" Elijah's expression hardened. He stepped away from the crowd, his free hand curling into a fist. "Who is this?" A low chuckle. "Let's just say, you've made the wrong enemies." Then the line went dead. Elijah slowly lowered the phone, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He had just exposed one problem. But it seemed the real fight was just beginning. Elijah stood in the middle of the bank lobby, his phone still in his hand. The words from the unknown caller echoed in his mind. "You've made the wrong enemies." He had expected pushback. People like Davis never operated alone, but this was something else. Marcus stepped closer. "Everything okay?" Elijah slipped the phone back into his pocket, his face unreadable. "Looks like some people aren't happy about today." Marcus smirked. "That usually means you did something right." Elijah let out a small breath, then turned his attention back to the employees still standing in stunned silence. They had just watched their manager walk out in disgrace, had just learned that everything about the way this bank was being run was about to change. Some looked relieved. Others looked uncertain. "I know today was a lot," Elijah said, keeping his tone even. And I know change isn't easy. But this bank is going to be what it was always meant to be. A place where every customer is treated fairly. His eyes moved over each employee. If you want to be part of that, I'll give you the tools to do it. But if you don't, you know where the door is. A few moments of silence passed. Then Karen spoke up. I want to stay. Elijah nodded, appreciating her courage. Lisa hesitated, then took a deep breath. Me too. One by one, others followed. Some still seemed nervous, but the message was clear. Most of them hadn't agreed with how things had been run. They had just been too afraid to speak up. But now things were different. Greg, however, remained quiet. He was shifting from foot to foot, his gaze darting around like he was looking for an escape. Elijah noticed. Greg, he said, his voice calm but firm. Something you want to say? Greg swallowed hard. I just followed orders. Elijah tilted his head slightly. That's not an answer. Greg glanced at Karen, then at Lisa, then back at Elijah. Finally he exhaled and muttered, I want to stay. Elijah studied him for a moment before nodding. Then do better. Greg gave a small, almost embarrassed nod, looking away. With that, Elijah turned to his team. We'll be conducting a full internal audit. Policies will change, oversight will be tighter, and from now on, fairness will be the standard, not the exception. Marcus glanced at the door. Speaking of fairness, should we let Mr. Davis know we'll be reporting his actions to the authorities? Elijah's expression didn't change. He'll find out soon enough. For the first time all day the bank felt different. The tension that had once lingered in the air was still there, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't fear, it was change. And change always came with uncertainty. But it was necessary. As Elijah and his team wrapped up the last of their work, he knew this wasn't the end. The phone call had made that clear. There were bigger forces at play, people who had been comfortable with the way things were, people who stood to lose from the changes he was making. But that didn't bother him, because he wasn't done yet. As he stepped outside, feeling the cool air against his face, Marcus walked beside him. So, Marcus said, hands in his pockets. What now? Elijah glanced back at the bank, then ahead at the city stretching out before them. Now, he exhaled. Now we keep going. And with that they walked forward, leaving the past behind, knowing that the future was theirs to shape.